cementing an occupation. From a flashpoint neighborhood in East Jerusalem to massive housing projects across the West Bank, both condemnation and the courts have failed to protect Palestinian land from settlements. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the growing reach of Israeli settlers. They've lived there for generations, but Israeli courts have ruled they do not own their homes. Palestinian families in occupied East Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood have been fighting for decades as Israeli settlers lay claim to their land. 6 months ago, the Supreme Court ordered the expulsion of 4 Palestinian families. It triggered a violent 11-day war on Gaza. Then last month, the very same court proposed a controversial compromise deal. The families would be allowed to stay in their homes for at least 15 years as protected tenants. But there was a catch. In exchange, they'd lose ownership and be forced to pay rent to Israeli settlers. Tuesday was the last day to accept the deal, and this is how they responded.
We unanimously rejected the settlement proposed by the Occupation Court, making us protected tenants at the Nahalat Shimon Settlement Association, gradually paving the way for the confiscation of our right to our lands. This rejection derives from our belief in the justice of our cause and our right to our homes and our homeland, despite the absence of any tangible guarantees to strengthen our Palestinian presence in occupied Jerusalem by any party or institution.
Well, the issue of settlements in the occupied territories has been called the biggest obstacle to peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Despite being illegal under international law, Israel has for decades continued to build them exponentially. In 1977, there were just under 4,500 settlers living in the West Bank. A decade later, they totaled more than 60,000. By 1999, that number had more than tripled to almost 184,000. In 2006, more than 250,000 were living illegally in the West Bank. And just last year, the number of settlers was close to 465,000 people. Now, if Palestinians were hopeful things would be different without Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump in power, they might be disappointed. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's coalition government has vowed to reduce tensions with the Palestinians, but so far it seems those efforts have failed. Last week, Israel slated another 3,000 new settler homes in the West Bank. The Palestinian Prime Minister cried out for international intervention.
The new settlement programs announced by Israel put the whole world, and the United States in particular, in front of huge responsibilities to challenge the status quo that is systematically imposed by Israel. The recent announcement of new settlement units is a flagrant aggression on our lands. On the other hand, the Palestinian cabinet rejects showcasing this announcement as a bargain for the recent Israeli permission to build 1,300 new Palestinian homes. This is completely rejected because settlements are an aggression against the Palestinian owners of lands.
Now, of course, the U.S. and Israel share a special relationship, but in a rare rebuke of its ally, Washington slammed Bennett's government. State Department spokesperson Ned Price condemned the expansion, warning it would only hurt the peace process.
We strongly oppose the expansion of settlements, which is completely inconsistent with efforts to lower tensions and to ensure calm, and it damages the prospects for a two-state solution. We have been consistent, as I said, and clear in our statements to this effect. We also view plans for the retroactive legalization of illegal outposts as unacceptable. We continue to raise our views on this issue directly with senior Israeli officials in our private discussions.
Let's get to our panel now. And joining me from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank is Mustafa Barghouti. He is the Palestinian National Initiative's General Secretary. Daniel Seidemann is an Israeli attorney and director of the Israeli NGO Terrestrial Jerusalem, which tracks settlement expansion. And from London, Ian Black, a visiting senior fellow with the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics and former Middle East editor at The Guardian. Thanks all so much for being with me. Ian, was this the right decision for the Sheikh Jarrah residents to make?
Well, you know, Mustafa and Daniel are in a far better position to me than to answer that question. But
As an
I
observer, though.
wanted to, well, I think in the big picture, let's zoom out. The Israeli court decision, the Supreme Court decision, is not available to Palestinians who seek to reclaim property in pre-1948 Israel. So in the big picture, the Israelis and Palestinians do not have equal rights in determining the right to own property on either side of the conflict. And that's a key element of this very divisive story.
Okay, so Daniel, let me get your take first on the decision. And I mean, this, we have to remember, is the compromise that was made to avoid eviction. And obviously it's not good enough for the Palestinians. So is there a risk now as well that the next offer could be worse, or that Palestinians could just be dragged out by force?
You know, it's very difficult to speculate what will happen next. Second-guessing Supreme Courts is a very risky endeavor. Having said that, there appears to be very little wiggle room, and I believe that a court ruling will be forthcoming in the weeks to come, perhaps by year's end. In all likelihood, that court ruling will be against the residents of Sheikh Jarrah. To be honest, I don't think that the Israeli court can rule otherwise, because the Israeli court is incapable of recognizing the reality of occupation. If an Israeli Supreme Court justice sees East Jerusalem is occupied, he or she will have to resign. There will those who will say, well, even if there's a verdict, it will never be carried out. I'm sure that those are the assurances that the Israeli government will be giving. We won't carry out the verdict. They will be sincere and they will be wrong. If there will be a verdict, there will be an eviction. I consider that to be the most likely scenario. One coalition crisis, one round of elections, one terror attack with double-digit casualties, they will be evicted. So this is a very dire development.
Okay, so essentially, Daniel, the Palestinians had two terrible options to choose from, but did they make the right choice, given what you've said, that eviction is probably imminent?
I am an Israeli. I oppose occupation, but as an Israeli, that makes me an occupier. It is not for me to judge. It is a horrible dilemma. I have one concern, and I say this with great hesitation. The Palestinian residents, to a certain extent, became captives of their own success. They became symbols. And as a result, there were huge pressures on them to reject the settlement. Now, I'm not saying rejecting the settlement was wrong. I'm not entirely sure that they were given all of the breathing space and that the autonomy that they deserved. But there is no alternative. It's not for me as an Israeli to judge that. They made their decision, and I can only empathize with them and try to mitigate the ramifications of the plight in which they find themselves.
Okay, Mustafa, was it the right decision as a Palestinian yourself?
This was absolutely the right decision, and the only decision that we should make as Palestinians, as inhabitants of Sheikh Jarrah. Had the people accepted the ruling of the court, this would have justified and legitimized the previous evictions that has taken place in Sheikh Jarrah. You know, this is not the first time that houses are threatened, and these are not the first families that are going to be evicted. So there were many families that were evicted before. So if these families have accepted this deal, that would have mean they would have legitimized the previous evictions. And more than that, they would legitimize the future evictions, because they would have given the power to the Israeli side to decide what is legal and what is not legal. And this court by itself is a court of occupation. And it's a court that is serving the interest of illegal settlers and illegal actions in Jerusalem. If they had accepted this deal, they would have approved actually their own eviction in a few years from now. So all in all, the principle here is that Israel has no right to take away their ownership or their residency or evicting them at all. This was a principled position, and it was the correct position to take. Why Israel did not evict people up to now, I just want to clarify that. It's because of three factors. One factor is the Palestinian wonderful, popular civil resistance on the ground. Second, it's because of international solidarity that is embarrassing Israel about what it might be doing. And third, because there is a risk that any eviction from Sheikh Jarrah could probably lead to a serious military escalation.
Okay. I mean, as you say, though, that if they had accepted this decision, it would have legitimized evictions. The settlers and the Israeli courts are effectively arguing that they're not accepting it will legitimize their own eviction going forward, as Daniel foresees them actually being forcefully taken out. So if they are, Mustafa, I'll stay with you. If they are forced out, what happens? Will we see potentially a new war in Gaza? I mean, in occupied East Jerusalem.
Not only in Gaza, you could see a full-fledged uprising in the whole of the West Bank. And not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but actually also inside 1948 territories, in what is called Israel today. I mean, what the big lesson from what has happened in May is this wonderful and unprecedented unity between all groups of the Palestinian people, all parts of the Palestinian people. And that is a reflection of the fact that what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah, like what's happening in Al-Fahim or in Lud or in Ramallah, is actually the same Israeli policy, a policy not only of occupation, but a policy of a system of racial discrimination and apartheid that is practiced against Palestinians.
Okay.
What Israel wants to do is to legitimize its ownership of Sheikh Jarrah. And Sheikh Jarrah is part of an occupied territory, and any change in the status of these houses or this neighborhood is a violation of international law.
Ian, was Naftali Bennett at all then sincere when he said he wanted to reduce tension with the Palestinians?
Well, you know, Naftali Bennett leads a government which is an unwieldy coalition. It's good that it's replaced the divisive rule and the damaging rule of Benjamin Netanyahu, but the policy of shrinking the conflict, in inverted commas, is not going to work in my view. Recently, the Defense Minister Benny Gantz announced that 6 Palestinian NGOs are going to be recognized in future as terrorist organizations. That's not a helpful move in shrinking the conflict. Criticism in Israel has focused on the fact that announcing that controversial decision has attracted attention unjustifiably to the perpetuation of the conflict. So the policy of shrinking the conflict under Naftali Bennett is not going to work. And I think you have to view it in the big picture and zoom out that the failure of the two-state solution is not going to leave the world to ignore this most divisive of conflicts. And I think in the big picture, this court ruling and its rejection by the Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah is underlining that fundamental point.
Okay. Daniel Seidemann, in your opinion, I mean, is this a battle worth fighting for Israel with so much negative attention to stand by the claims of a few settlers at this point? Or does it win them elections at home?
This is a battle that Israel should not be engaged in. You know, there are most of the issues between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people are territorial, but there are two radioactive issues that cut to the core of this conflict. and they touch on the very identities of Israelis and Palestinians. One is Jerusalem, and the Jewish people would not be the Jewish people without Jerusalem, but the same can be said of the Palestinians. And both peoples are refugee peoples, and as a formative experience, and the Palestinian people would not be who they are in the formative experience of Nakba. And what we are doing here is contrary to our own self-interest. We are kicking the hornet's nest of the Nakba. We are engaged in a Nakba reenactment. What we're witnessing is that the policies of occupation were not the policies of the Netanyahu government alone. Netanyahu was successful in splicing his ideological DNA into the operative DNA of official Israel. Netanyahu is gone, but that DNA persists. The policeman at Damascus Gate does not require an order to beat up a Palestinian kid. Occupation is not the policy. Occupation is what we do. Now, I think Naftali Bennett is a much more decent person and an honorable person than Mr. Netanyahu is. But in order for him to change this, he has to recognize the reality of occupation and roll it back. And I see no indication that he is even acknowledging its existence. So to a certain extent, the occupation deniers in Israel are geopolitical equivalents of anti-vaxxers and climate change denials. I consider that to be horrible for the Palestinians, but also bad for Israel.
Daniel, I'm going to stick with you for a minute because I want to make sure we are understanding this specific case properly. These settlers are actually not the descendants of the original owners of this land, but they're so it's not the original owners looking to get their homes back. These are settler groups who've actually bought the titles off some descendants of the ex-owners, and they are now saying this is their property. Is that exactly what's happening? This actually is, when people do say it is in essence a real estate battle, it kind of is.
It's not a real estate battle because this is not landlord tenant, because it's taking place between one collective represented by the settlers who have political power and the other collective represented by Palestinian residents who have no political power. And when you have one city, two peoples, one with political power and the other without, that pesky A word, just becomes inevitable. The settlers never lived in the homes in question. The homes in question were built in 1955 and 1956 by the Jordanian government for these families who were refugees in 1948. They are the only families, the only human beings who have ever lived in these houses. So to say, oh shucks, this is just Jews returning to their ancestral home, that is incorrect. Okay. Legally, there's a Jewish claim to title, but in reality, the only people who have known these homes are the Palestinians who are living there. What we're also witnessing is an implementation of a Jewish right of return, so to speak, to ancestral biblical Israel, while denying the Palestinian right of return to ancestral Palestine. The settlers who never lived there are saying, we're just going home. Well, what about the folks in East Jerusalem who have homes in Baka and the German colony and elsewhere? We are poking our fingers in the two most sensitive areas of the conflict, Jerusalem and the right of return and refugees.
And Mustafa, I mean, if for the settlers, in a sense, getting rights to this land is a step toward claiming all of Jerusalem, you know, that they want to see as their capital, and or at the very least further complicating any chance of creating a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, correct?
Not only that, I think what you have here are right-wing, extreme, racist governments in Israel, and I think it's shameful that a party like Meretz or the Labour Party that claim to be on the left are participating and joining this government, and while it's doing what it's doing. But the problem really is that we have a very serious right-wing shift in Israel as a whole. in the Israeli society. Otherwise, how come these parties like Likud and Lieberman and Naftali Bennett and all the other extremists get so many votes from the Israeli public? Simply speaking, the whole Israeli society, let's say not the whole, but the majority of the Israeli society has shifted to the left, to the right, and shifted to racism and to a system of apartheid. That is the painful reality. And actually, these settlers represent only the front group of this tendency. But what Israel is doing is destroying the very possibility, not only of two-state solution, but of the possibility of peace in general.
Okay.
And what they are doing is really trying. I mean, I heard you speak about easing the tension, or as they call it, reduce the conflict. They are not reducing any conflict. They are actually trying to enforce on Palestinians a process of domestication, and they are trying to have Palestinians submit to occupation and oppression and the system of apartheid. This will never happen. If Israel kills the two-state solution, and let me be clear, if they kill the two-state solution, and actually they are killing it, the only left option will be one democratic state with no apartheid, with no racial discrimination, with the right of all Palestinian refugees to come back home to the places they were displaced from. This is, the Palestinians will never accept to be slaves of a system of apartheid.
Okay. You know, Daniel, I have to come back to you because we'll remember the most significant step to cut back on settlements was taken by Ariel Sharon back in 2005. It showed that it can be done, but in hindsight now, how did that move serve Israeli interests, and how is it actually influencing decisions on settlements today? It's not always to Palestinian benefit, obviously.
No, it was claimed at the time that Ariel Sharon evacuated settlements in Gaza in order to end the occupation of Gaza. In reality, the occupation in Gaza is as tight and as egregious as ever before. It's possible to occupy without the presence of settlements. The settlements clearly contribute to that. But it goes beyond that. Sharon's motivation in evacuating the settlements in Gaza was to empower him to increase, expand, and accelerate settlement expansion in the West Bank. And today, we are watching a metastasizing occupation. Settlements are expanding. Nobody needs marching orders within official Israel to approve settlement plans. Sometimes they take place even without the knowledge and consent of the Israeli prime minister and of the foreign minister, which by no means absolves them of responsibility. Occupation is not what we do. Occupation is who we are. And Israel, in order to heal itself, has to go to rehab, to get rid of our addiction to the crack of settlements and occupation, and to not to shrink the conflict, but to deoccupy the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And there is no indication of that happening.
Okay. Ian Black, I'm going to finish on this, and we just have a few minutes. But if you can synthesize what you think this is all symbolic of, given this is all happening on the anniversary, actually, of the Balfour Declaration. How symbolic is that?
Well, of course, the Balfour Declaration was a significant moment in the development of the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's no question about that. It was conducted by the then British government, which arrogantly ignored the wishes of what it defined as the non-Jewish population of Palestine. It was a key moment in the development and success of the Zionist movement in the wake of the First World War. And of course, the war that followed in 1939 reinforced the Zionist position in terms of the unspeakable horrors of the Nazi Holocaust. So I think the coincidence of that date and is quite symbolic, as you have pointed out.
Yeah.
I think in the big picture, the failure of the two-state solution is obviously not good news for the future of both Palestinians and Israelis. And I agree with Daniel Seidemann that it's in Israel's interest to end the occupation.
Okay.
The alternative is achieving a one-state solution with equal rights between the river and the sea, to use the increasingly fashionable phrase, is, in my view, not in any way achievable
Okay,
or
Ian,
attainable.
we will have to
So-
leave it there. I'd like to
Okay.
thank all three of
Thank
you
you.
really so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And thank our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.